asking whether the imagery of both of those might be tied up into the accounts of the crucifixion, and the answer to that is absolutely yes. Jesus almost certainly did die during a Passover feast in Jerusalem. And so Christians naturally connected him, after his death, connected his death with the Passover. And the idea quickly developed that the Passover celebration of God providing salvation for his enslaved people has now come to fulfillment in the death of his son. So now the Exodus is foreshadowing the ultimate salvation, not from the powers that are oppressing us and making us slaves, but from the powers of evil that are throughout the world, so that now we can truly belong to God. But also, very quickly, the followers of Jesus understood Jesus' death to be an atonement. And so this is Yom Kippur imagery. So when Jesus dies in our earliest account, the Gospel of Mark, we're told that the moment he dies, the curtain in the temple rips in half. This is the curtain that only the high priest, only one day a year, could go behind to enter into the Holy of Holies. The high priest is the only one who has direct access to God and performs a sacrifice for the sins of the people. Now, with Jesus' death, according to Mark, the temple curtain has been ripped, and so now everybody has access to God all the time, not through the sacrifices of the high priest on Yom Kippur, but through the death of the Son of God, Jesus. And so it replaces the need for Yom Kippur. The other question then, is it possible that the crucifixion is a purely literary device to explain these things? Obviously you have to consider that as a possible argument, but I think that the answer has to be no. It's not just a literary device. You have to ask whether, when you have an account of like something happening in the past, whether it's Jesus walking on the water or George Washington crossing the Delaware, you have to ask, what kind of evidence is there? And apart from how the story might function for somebody who's a big believer in Jesus or a big believer in George Washington, apart from how the story functions for those who are devotees, you have to ask, what's the evidence, pure and simple? Just you're a historian, you want to know what happened. And when you apply those criteria, I'm not sure what you come up with George Washington crossing the Delaware. I'm sure he did. I'm not sure the accounts of it are completely accurate. But in terms of the crucifixion, it's kind of the same thing. The evidence is so overwhelming that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate that it looks like what's going on is that there really was a crucifixion, that Jesus really was executed for claiming to be the king of the Jews. That's why they got him. They did it. They crucified him as they would anyone else who was making a political claim like that. But then the Christians tried to make sense of it because they believed he got raised from the dead, which shows that God is favoring him. And if God's favoring him, why would he get crucified? Is this what God does to the people he favors? He crucifies them? And so Christians started thinking, well, no, it can't be that. It's got to be there's a reason for it. And they immediately started making the Passover associations and the separate Yom Kippur associations. And so they started interpreting Jesus' death that way. The death itself is historical, but the interpretations are theological.
Got another super chat. Michael E., thank you for your super chat. Do you think that Christianity today and in the future will be able to successfully absorb and adapt to modern historical critical scholarship?
That's a very good question. Some forms of Christianity absolutely have successfully done that already. The kind of things I've been talking about here just now, and the kinds of things I always, write about and talk about on my blog and on my podcast and various places are things that I learned when I was in a Christian seminary being trained as a Christian minister. Princeton Theological Seminary it's a Presbyterian seminary. I wasn't Presbyterian, but I went there anyway. And this is the kind of information I would have gotten in my classes there. so historical scholarship is very important for mainline thinking Christians. They're the best scholars of the New Testament, the best critical scholars of the New Testament are almost all Christians who've absolutely absorbed this into their religion. But they're not fundamentalists. Fundamentalists who have a view of Scripture that it can't have any mistakes in it cannot be critical historians. And if they become critical historians, their understanding of the religion simply can't survive that. But that doesn't mean that Christianity can't survive it. Christianity, in order to absorb historical scholarship, has to change some of its theological views. Not all of them, and more liberal mainline Christians would argue not the most important ones. But certainly somebody's view of Scripture has to change if they take a historical critical view of it. That's what happened to me. It happened to lots and lots of my friends, and most of my friends are still Christian. And so my scholar friends in New Testament studies, most of them are still Christian. They simply have re-understood what the faith is all about in a better way, a modern way, where they don't ignore science. And they don't ignore scholarship. They don't ignore history. They actually are completely scholarly, but they think that in some sense Christ is the way God reveals Himself, for example. So I think it's possible. Will it happen? The problem is that the only forms of Christianity that seem to be
I'm only getting double-digit views on all my YouTube videos.
Evangelical groups,
after
Pentecostal, might be
14 years of trying,
kind of
I had to resort to this type of shit.
social.
I said this type of shit. This shit.
A lot of evangelicals
Pun
don't
intended.
that much about doctrine or about particular beliefs, social agendas that they think
That's my shit.
are their evangelical communities. But the people who do take the kind of doctrine stuff seriously, these are the groups that are expanding in Christianity. The groups that emphasize kind of scholarship and historical knowledge and science. Even though they're Christian, they seem to be dwindling. And it's probably because most people think, well, once you get rid of some of the major doctrines of Christianity, why even bother being Christian now? I'm not sure that necessarily makes sense, but that is what
I have not looked. I'm afraid to see if my form
shrinking
is longer or not, because it's probably going to be shorter than hers.
Ones are expanding.
When did Christians start coming? When did they start? When did they start coming to the belief that Jesus
If only my
was God?
I think that the belief started at the point where some of Jesus' followers believed He got raised from the dead. I don't think there's anything to suggest that His followers suspected He might be a divine being while He was alive. But once you think that He got raised from the dead, it's not, as I said earlier, it's not just that His body was revivified. They could look around, they saw Jesus was not with us anymore. And if He got taken out of His grave and He's not with us, where is He? They concluded fairly quickly that He had been taken up to the divine realm. We know of other individuals like that in Greek circles, in Roman circles, and in Jewish circles. You get people like Apollonius of Tyana, who's made a divine being, some years after Jesus, a Greek fellow. You have the founder of Rome, Romulus, who's taken up to heaven and is worshipped by the Romans then as one of their chief gods after that. You have, even within Judaism, it was sometimes thought that Enoch had been made a divine being, or that Moses had been made a divine being and could sometimes be called God. And so people don't know that about Judaism, but I talk about this in my book, how Jesus became God, how even within Judaism, the idea that somebody gets elevated to the heavenly realm is just understood automatically to mean that that person is made into a divine being. And so I think the followers of Jesus, when they came to think He had been raised from the dead and had been taken up to heaven, I think they thought that, well, He's a divine being in that sense. It's only much later the Christians started saying things like he existed before he was born, or he was born of a virgin, or he came down from heaven, or that he really is God, or that he's fully God, or that he in fact is equal with God the Father. that is a later development. But to say that he is God in some sense happened, I think, right away, soon after they believed in the resurrection.
Is the Gospel of John the only book in the entire New Testament to claim that Jesus is God? Or did John use a prior source that's lost that may have come up with the idea first?
Well, I would say that our earliest author of the New Testament thinks Jesus is God. The Apostle Paul, I think, certainly believes in the divinity of Jesus. You can see this in his one of his letters, especially, but in his letter to the Philippians, chapter 2, verses 6 to 11, he describes Christ's incarnation. He says that Christ was in the form of God, but that he didn't regard equality with God, something that he to grasp after, to reach out for. Instead, he emptied himself and became a human. And then as a human, he was obedient to God by dying on the cross. And therefore God exalted him to a higher level than he had been before. He'd already been in the form of God, and now he's made equal with God in terms of people needing to worship him. That he is worshipped as God is worshipped. So this is in the book of Philippians, so it's before any of our Gospels. In our Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as I pointed out, they don't have that view. John has a similar view that's to Paul had, although John's view is even more elevated for who Christ is. And so
I have not looked. I'm afraid to see if my form is longer or not, because it's probably going to be shorter than hers.
Of Jesus, or
and for that, I curse God.
Must develop.
And because I'm pissed off about my forms not being longer than these females' forms,
kind of linear thing.
I did this
at one point
about 5 minutes ago.
Then at that point, Christians thought that. Then at this other
Fuck
point,
you, God, if I do not have the long forms.
On the same line.
I'll take any judgment you can bring against me. Just let me have my thing for 15 minutes with the long
At
forms.
the same time, who believe different things.
See this
And
shit?
yet people who
You see this shit?
what earlier people thought.
Yeah.
You have later people thinking what later people thought. You got earlier.
That's
people
my shit.
thinking what
That's my
later
shit.
people thought. It's just like today.
Right beside the
What
goddamn
Christians think about X,
trucker cab.
is which Christians.
If only my
And it's that way in the early church too. So people say, well, look, if Paul thought that Jesus was God before he existed, before he became born, then Mark must have thought that too. No, they're living in different parts of the world. They don't know each other. They have different theologies, just like two different Christians today. Somebody in Romania, and somebody in Rome, and somebody in Rome, Georgia. Those three people can all be devout Christians and have very different views of who Christ is and everything else. So I don't think it's a linear view, but I do think that there's our earliest author already thought that Jesus was a pre-existent divine being who acquired equality with God only at the resurrection and his exaltation. John is our only gospel to have that understanding of things, and so it's a valid question. Did he have some kind of source for it? We don't know what his sources of information were. We can hypothesize about them, and scholars have. It's been a very common scholarly pastime to hypothesize about John's sources, and it's an important exercise to engage in, but it never reaches the level of certitude. There are, though, other books in the New Testament that certainly see Jesus as God. I mean, in the book of Revelation, he's absolutely portrayed as a divine being, for example.
Does the Gospel of John utilize the synoptics, or is it independent of them?
It depends which scholar you ask. So, When I was in graduate school in the 70s and the 80s, the complete orthodoxy was that John was independent, that he did not use Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Over the last 5 or 10 years, scholars have reversed that judgment so that a lot of scholars now think that he did have access to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that in some sense, John's gospel is riffing on the stories in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That is completely possible, but I myself am not at all convinced by it. And in part, it's not just because I'm an old dinosaur who's sticking to the orthodoxy, although maybe it is that. But the reason I don't think that that's a satisfying solution is because I think I have a higher burden of proof for somebody says that this document was the source for that document. How would you possibly know that? How would you know that this later author utilized an earlier document? It's an important question that applies not just to the New Testament, but to all sorts of ancient literature. Who's writing before whom, and is the later person dependent on the earlier one, and how do you decide? For a long time, there's been a high standard of proof that I still subscribe to. When you're reading Matthew and you're reading Mark, you will find sentences that are word for word the same in Greek. Sometimes like several sentences in a row that are word for word the same. That is not possible unless somebody is copying somebody. You can only get that if there's copying. And in that case, there are really, really good reasons for thinking that Matthew copied Mark as one of his sources. And it's completely compelling evidence. That is precisely what
stupid
John in relationship to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You don't have those verbatim agreements. You have broad agreements.
Stupid!
The entire ministry of Jesus in John, just about the entire ministry, is really different. What he says, what he does, why he says it, why he does it, and the stories themselves are not the same stories. They're different stories. There are a few places where there are overlaps. Jesus does walk on the water in John, as he does in Matthew and in Mark. And so, so they've got some stories in common. But the way they're told are so different. Does it look like John's using Matthew and Mark as a source? And the other side, which is comprised of scholars who are really superb scholars, say, look, you get these commonalities, and that suggests, that John's doing his own thing, but he's got these stories, especially in the Passion narrative, from the time Jesus goes into Jerusalem to the time he's raised from the dead. You have stories. They're very similar, and if John didn't use Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he must have, because he's got the same stories. You say that, but then I just think that it is. I think it's far too simple a view of what was going on in early Christianity. By that I mean this. The Gospel of Luke, the author Luke, begins by saying that many people have written an account of the things that Jesus said and did. Many people. Now we have good reason for thinking that Luke, like Matthew, used Mark as one of his sources. Most people still think that Matthew and Luke also had another source for many of the sayings of Jesus that scholars call Q. And so we know that Luke had those two sources. But two sources is not many sources. He says that many people have written this thing about what Jesus said and did. Well, where are they? We don't have them. But Luke at least says they existed. I don't see any reason to think he was making that one up. Why would he make? I think that he's just acknowledging, look, a lot of people have done this, and now I'm going to do it. So there were lots of Gospels in circulation. Every now and then, new Gospels show up, not as old as these, but it shows that people were writing things down. I think the situation was really messy around, say, the year 100, when John was written, 90, 95, 100, right in there somewhere. There were probably lots of accounts floating around. Mark was used by Matthew and Luke. Who else was it used by? Matthew was used by later writers. Well, who was it used by in the first century, who wrote their own accounts? I think there were probably lots of accounts around and lots of oral traditions. Stories about Jesus walking on the water were simply stories that were told by people by word of mouth. The fact that John has it and Matthew has it doesn't show that John used Matthew. The problem with this view that, if John has stories like Matthew, Mark, and Luke and riffs on them in interesting ways, and therefore he had Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I think he's just ignoring the fact that we have all these other things back there, and it's assuming that we always have the smoking gun. In other words, these are similar, that's the smoking gun. Look, there were lots of smoking guns, and to say that we just happen to have all of them seems to me really not to be very satisfying. And so I don't think that there is good evidence that John actually had something like our Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He may have, but I don't see any compelling reason to think he did, given the fact there were so many others that were available to him, so many other sources. And again, you don't get the verbatim agreements that would really cinch the deal.
I'd like to circle back to Paul. Why do you believe that the Philippians hymn was not originally composed by Paul, but was actually pre-Pauline?
It's a good question. First, let me clarify what scholars mean by pre-Pauline, because many people don't understand that phrase, including, I've found to my chagrin, many scholars. There are passages in Paul, as there are in other writings of the New Testament, where it appears that he is not composing his letter at this point, that he's not deciding what words to put down, but he's actually quoting something that he's familiar with. He's actually quoting some other text, either a written or an oral text that was around before he wrote this letter. Pre-Pauline refers to one of these pieces of material that Paul has incorporated into his letters. It's pre-Pauline in the sense that it existed prior to him putting it into this letter. It is not pre-Pauline necessarily, or almost certainly. It's not pre-Pauline in the sense that some people say, which is they say, so that was around before Paul was a Christian. That's not what pre-Pauline means in this context, and so many people don't seem to understand that, which is really important because there are people who say things like this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 5, looks like it's pre-Pauline. This is where Paul says that I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ Jesus died according to the Scriptures, and he was buried, and that he was raised from the dead on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and the 12. Okay? You have that statement in 1 Corinthians 15, which is an encapsulation of the kinds of things Paul is preaching about Jesus' death and resurrection. And scholars have reason for thinking that just as he says he inherited this, he got it himself before he passed it along, that it was floating around before he wrote this book. And so, but then some scholars say, so it was pre-Pauline, that means it must have been composed a couple of years after Jesus' death. And man, scholars say this, you don't understand what pre-Pauline means. It just means that Paul had access to this creed, or however you want to characterize it, before he wrote the letter. And in this case, he says he handed it on to the Corinthians when he preached to them, so sometimes before when he converted them in the early 50s. And so it was around before that. The same thing is true with the Philippians hymn. It's called the Philippians hymn, even though it's not a hymn. I usually call it the Philippians poem, but I think traditionally it's been called the Philippians hymn. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 to 11, this passage where I've already talked about, that Christ was in the form of God, he gave up equality with God, became a human, and then because he obeyed God, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that's above every name. And so he gave him the name Lord, so that every knee would bow before him and every tongue would confess him, just as they do with God the Father. I agree with the majority opinion about this from among Pauline scholars, that this passage was something Paul's quoting, not something that he's composing. He seems to be quoting something that is pre-existent, in other words, before he wrote this letter to the Philippians. And so it had to be around in the early 50s.
I'm so glad he didn't the fuck out of me.
Latest, I would say. And so, why do scholars think that this thing is not just something Paul's composing on the spot? Of course, there are controversies about it. Some scholars think this is a Pauline composition, or that it was a Pauline composition for another occasion that Paul is reusing here. But there are various reasons for thinking that it's actually not Paul's composition. One thing is that its portrayal of Christ is not exactly the way he puts it somewhere. He puts it in other places. He never talks about Christ being in the form of God. Christ, pre-existent Christ, not wanting to grasp after or to reach for.
Now fuck up and take that poem.
He's got the form of God, but he's not equal with God. Those aren't characteristic ways of Paul speaking. But more than that, he is using this passage. This is going to get in the weeds a little bit, but he's using this passage in Philippians to tell his Philippian readers that they need to stop being concerned for themselves and be more concerned for other people, for one another within the community. And in this context, Paul says that they should have the same mindset that Christ had. And then he explains that Christ was in the form of God, but he didn't regard equality with God as a thing to be grasped after. And he goes through and he explains that Christ gave up everything for the sake of others and then died on the cross. You should live like that. You shouldn't be seeking your own glory. You shouldn't behave in self-aggrandizing ways. You should be concerned about your neighbor more than yourself. You should be living for others. Look what Christ did. Okay, so that all works. But this poem that he's quoting, the first half of it is about how Christ humbled himself. The second part is about how God therefore exalted him. And that doesn't seem to fit in the context of what Paul's saying here, because that would mean that the reason you care for your neighbor is so that you'll get exalted. And his point is, you're not supposed to worry about yourself. You're supposed to worry about your neighbor. And so the second half of the poem doesn't seem to fit the context for what Paul's trying to do with it. And that suggests that he didn't compose this for the occasion. Because if he composed it for the occasion, he wouldn't bring up that part, because then people would just be self-aggrandizing in a different way. Yeah, I'm going to be nice to you, so I'll get another star in my crown. So that doesn't make any sense. So that's why scholars have thought that it's an independent unit that probably was not composed by Paul, but he was comfortable with, that he put in at this point.
Michael E., thank you for your super chat. To what degree does YouTube affect New Testament scholarship?
Well, so far as I know, it doesn't affect it at all. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I guess what it does is I don't think that it affects the scholarship. To my knowledge, it doesn't.
That whore. That whore.
Well, hello everybody, in our live stream Skype podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor John Kloppenborg. And today we're talking about the
Come on, you whore.
Did James, the brother of Jesus, compose the Epistle of James? And this is based on his book entitled James, New Testament Guides. I have a link
you
to purchase
slut that slut from China, Japan, and the Orient.
And so I'd like to start with this question.
You Oriental prostitute.
If James did or did not compose this letter, and if he didn't, was it simply just composed by another man named James, or not at all?
Well,
I watched your video.
Oh, okay.
try checking your settings?
God fucking damn it.
Where would I find the setting? Oh, there's settings. Okay.
Yeah.
Holy Ghost.
Camera.
Holy Ghost.
It's not giving me anything.
Holy Ghost.
Huh. Wonder what happened.
I don't know. Should I exit and re-enter quickly? That might.
Yeah. Let's see if that works. Sorry, buddies. This is guess we have a technical difficulty that just suddenly decided to happen. So just have to wait a second here.
See you. Yeah, and I see me.
Yep. Okay, looks like it's working again.
Let's hope I don't disappear again. So how do we know? Well, James actually presents some really interesting puzzles. It's clearly attributed to somebody named James, and the consensus is, I think, a very strong consensus that the reader is expected to imagine that this is James, the brother of Jesus. He calls himself a slave of Jesus Christ rather than a brother. But I think it's fair to say that there are no other Jacobs or James that would immediately come to mind as the possible author. There's James the son of Zebedee, who's executed quite early, but it's James, the brother of Jesus, who has the widest reputation in early Christianity, and so I think it's natural to suppose, or it's natural for the reader to suppose that this comes from James, the brother of Jesus. Now, the scholarly question for us is created by a number of very interesting anomalies about the text. The first is that it was widely suspected in antiquity to have been a forgery. An author like Eusebius, even though in the fourth century, Eusebius himself believes that it is an authentic text, he reports that many people didn't think it was. And the same view is repeated a century later by Jerome, who also thinks it's an authentic text, but is well aware.
I gotta go piss.
Lots of questions have been raised about it as to whether it's really an authentic or an authoritative text at all. That puzzle is further aggravated by the fact that early Christian writers in the second and third centuries don't quote it. So even though there's some vocabulary overlap between James's language and the language of 1 Clement and say around the beginning of the second century, Hermas around the middle of the second century, and Luke Acts from, let's say, the beginning of the second century, there's no quotation of it, no allusion to James as a text. The first quotation that we have of James is from somewhere between 220 and 230, and that's the Christian writer Origen in Alexandria. And shortly thereafter, the Pseudo-Clementine letter on virginity pretty clearly quotes it as scripture. And after that, in the West, it's quoted it's quoted and sometimes named as quotations are named as coming from James by Western writers, Dionysius of Alexandria and so forth. In the Latin West, it's even stranger because the first quotation of James is not until Hilary of Poitiers in 356.
And it's a similar issue there that, well, prior to Hilary, there's just silence on James. James is not included in the Moratorian canon from about the year 200. And it's not included in Codex Beza, which is a bilingual Greek-Latin text that's identified with what we call the Western text. So there's just no Western witnesses of James at all. So the first question, or the first puzzle that should occur to us is, why, if James is an authentic letter from James, the brother of Jesus, does it not appear quoted by any Western writer until the beginning of the 3rd century, and not until the middle of the 4th?
Actually, I had to go take a shit too.
Christian writer. The puzzle is further aggravated by the fact that the entire Western stream of textual tradition, New Testament textual tradition, is missing. Text critics usually divide manuscripts into 3 streams. What the first one is called, we call it Alexandrian, or used to be called the neutral stream, represented by by things like Codex Alexandrinus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex.
Cause that was fucking stupid.
And then a Western stream where its attestation is in Western Greek fathers like Justin Martyr and so forth, and it's sort of classically embedded in Codex Beza, which is a 5th century manuscript, and then a lot of other writings. But James is completely missing from the Western stream, and it appears only in the Alexandrian stream and in the later Byzantine stream. So there's some really curious silences about James that one would think that if this really were an authentic letter from the brother of Jesus, it would have gotten into much wider circulation much earlier than it actually did. And that's at least one of the features of James that raises some questions about it. I think most of your audience will know that pseudepigraphy, that is writing something in another person's name, was not at all an uncommon practice in the ancient world. And so the fact that this is attributed to Iacobus, James, is not at all any guarantee that it was written either by James, the brother of Jesus, or even by somebody else whose name was James. And the transmissional profile of James, the points at which it shows up in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament and in the authors who quote biblical texts, is such that it really causes us to wonder whether we've got a text from the 1st century or we've got a text that's penned quite a lot later, and thus enters the evidentiary stream a lot later than other texts like the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of John, and some of Paul's letters, which have much earlier attestations than James. So that's kind of the problem that we're faced with. It's also interesting that James comes up as an important text during the Reformation in a famous debate between Johannes Eck and Martin Luther, where Eck quotes James, the statement, "Faith without works is dead." And Luther's reply is that he doesn't actually think that it's written by the apostle. He says its style is inferior to apostolic writings.
Damn it.
It doesn't have what he says, apostolic majesty of other writings. And it, in fact, it only mentions the name Jesus Christ twice, and never mentions the Spirit, and the doctrines that Luther looks for, sola scriptura and the primacy of belief or faith, they aren't there in James. And so this is one point where he first expresses some really serious doubts about James, and actually a little bit before Luther, Erasmus commenting on the letter. Now Erasmus didn't have any content of the letter, but Erasmus notices that it doesn't have any Hebraisms in it, or it has so few Hebraisms that it's very hard to imagine that it came from a native Aramaic or Hebrew speaker, James, the brother of Jesus. So he doesn't push that point any farther than that. But he notices that the content of James doesn't really look like it was written by someone who was a native Aramaic speaker or a native Greek speaker, a native Hebrew speaker. So those are some of the issues that James presents us with, that then raises this question about, is it really authored in the first century by somebody, by James, the brother of Jesus?
If it's trying to make us believe that James, the brother of Jesus, is the author of the text, how come at the opening statement of the letter of James, when James starts out saying that he wrote the text, how come it doesn't identify? How come the author does not identify himself as the brother of Jesus?
That's an interesting thing. I mean, he identifies himself as the slave rather than as the Adelphos. So that's a curiosity. Now, those who argue that it is pseudepigraphal, and I'm one of the ones that does that, but others would say, even if he had identified himself as James, the brother of Jesus, that wouldn't be a guarantee that the author was actually James, the brother of Jesus, because and the fact that he calls himself the slave of Christ doesn't also guarantee that this is authentic or inauthentic. But so that opening sentence really doesn't tell us one way or the other, because of this practice of pseudepigraphy, where authors, often composed in other people's names. I mean, we know, for example, that some of the letters attributed to Plato can't be from Plato. They might have been from Theophrastus, his disciple. But so they appear like they're coming from Plato, but the consensus is they're not Platonic.
What is the general theology of the letter? What is it trying to preach?
Now that's really very interesting, and I guess this can be unpacked in a couple of ways. One of the arguments that James wants to make is that the Torah continues to be valid. And that's going to get him into a kind of dispute with Paul.
Stupid!
Willing to dispense with certain
you
provisions
stupid
of the Torah,
bitch.
especially when it comes to Gentiles. But that's not going to be James's view.
Oh! I still my
James takes the view, he takes a kind of rigorous view.
Twist.
The best way to illustrate this is the way he deals with the way he talks in chapter 2. So he imagines a kind of hypothetical scenario of
this guy sounds
walking
drunk.
into what he calls their synagogue, and he uses the term synagogue to refer to whatever meeting space that he's imagining. And one of them's a rich man, and one of them's a poor person. And he says that what you do is you give the rich person fine clothing and a gold ring, the best seat in the house, and to the poor person you say, sit under my footstool. And then his complaint is, have you not created divisions among yourself? And he calls this, it's an invented term in the first century, prosopolemsia, which we could translate as favoritism, or something like that. But it's a term that has its roots in the Hebrew Bible in Leviticus 19, verse 15, where the writer of Leviticus warns against, in Hebrew it's called lifting the face, in a judicial context, which means paying attention, that the judge should not pay attention to the status of the litigant, but needs to simply judge the case on its merits. And so, and in the Septuagint, this becomes prosopon lambanein, and then those two words are sort of compressed into a single word, prosopolemsia, favoritism. So James begins with this complaint against favoritism, and then in the middle of that chapter, or a few verses in, he says, now he quotes Leviticus not 19:15 but 19:18. You should love your neighbor as yourself, the so-called golden rule, the golden rule, right? And he says, if you do that, you do well. But if at the same time you show prosopolemsia, favoritism, because the law is indivisible, that is, for James, you can't pick and choose among laws. You can't say, well, I'm going to obey Leviticus 19:18, but I'm going to ignore Leviticus 19:15. He has a legal theory, which we see also in the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs and a few other places. The idea that the law is unitary because God is unitary, and that means you can't pick and choose. If you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound, as far as he's concerned. And so he says, you actually, even though you do observe Leviticus 19:18, you're still a law breaker because you've broken the other law, and your whole claim to be Torah observant falls apart now. Now it's an interesting argument, and that's in one sense part of the heart of his theology, that the Torah still remains in effect as far as he's concerned. And that's going to be one of his complaints with Paul in the second part of chapter 2, where he attacks the notion that that simply saying that you believe is sufficient without the works that go with it. So it seems like he is advocating a theology. It's still connected with the Jesus movement, because he makes no pretense about his affiliation to Jesus. But it's a form of the Jesus movement which still takes Jewish identity and Jewish sensibilities as far as the Torah is concerned. So it's a really interesting text because it represents a different form of Christ belief or Christian practice than you see, especially in the Pauline stream, where, I think as everybody knows, Paul is quite prepared to exempt non-Jews from distinctively Jewish practices, especially circumcision.
Can you tell us a bit about the parallels between the letter of James with the Q document?
Yeah, now that's also really
that
interesting.
Whore.
Early on in the study of James, recognized that there were many sentences in James that looked like the Sermon on the Mount or Jesus tradition, but largely from the Sermon on the Mount. And yet, James never attributes these to Jesus. So he's got a version of seek and you'll find, but he doesn't say Jesus said seek and you'll find. So Jesus is never invoked as an authority with those synoptic-like sayings or Q-like sayings. They turn out to be almost all from what we identify as Q. So that actually also created a kind of puzzle. How is it, or why is it, that he seems to be citing the Jesus tradition, but never cites it as the Jesus tradition? It's kind of embedded in his discourse, submerged in his discourse, but not submerged to the extent that, say, a Christian reader in the 2nd century wouldn't spot where it's coming from. That is, there's just enough of Jesus sounding stuff surely, say a Christian user in the 2nd century will read James if James is composed by that time, and realize that there's a lot of Jesus here, and so it's been kind of a puzzle about why you've got Jesus sounding stuff, but it's never Jesus is never credited as the ultimate authority on that. And I think at least the way that I've suggested that we understand that is through a particular rhetorical practice that we know was in use both in Greek and in Latin writers. And in Latin, the term is called emulatio, or emulation. And the practice is that an author will take ideas or sentences, in fact, sayings, from previous writers. Often it's going to be Homer or Hesiod or Euripides or a writer who's pretty well known, and paraphrase the saying, never attributing, never saying, "Oh, this is from Homer," because it's expected that the audience will understand and part of the aesthetics of emulation is that the secondary writer can change many of the words, sometimes all of the words, update the grammar from Homeric grammar to Attic grammar, to substitute vocabulary, but leave enough of the gist of the sentence that the audience will realize, this is Homer. And as I say, part of the aesthetic of this practice is what Quintilian says, to vie with the original for beauty and appropriateness. That is, to show how you as a rhetorical performer can take a sentence from a much earlier document, or much earlier tradition, and apply it to your current situation with a kind of beauty and aptness. Now, if that's what James is doing, then what we actually see in James starts to make some sense, because what he has done in many cases is taken a Jesus saying that originated in a Palestinian environment, in a largely agrarian environment, and adapted it to urban usage. And the one example, I've got two examples, but one of them is the persecution beatitude, which is in Q 622 or Luke 622, that when you're persecuted, rejoice, be. Well, I've got two examples, but one of them is the persecution beatitude, which is in Q 622 or Luke 622, that when you're persecuted, rejoice, because the Greek text says your misthos is great in heaven. Now, misthos is a word that in Greek means wages. That's the standard word that is used for talking about the wages of agricultural workers. They get misthoi. Now, in more, let's say, higher class urban Greek, people don't want this. They don't get wages. So Cicero and Quintilian and Greek and Roman politicians don't get wages. That's rather déclassé to get wages, because it immediately marks you as a kind of low-class worker. What you get as a reward in the Greek and Roman world, in the civic Greek and Roman world, is a crown. That is something that either laurel leaves or olive leaves or gold leaves that you wear, that shows that you have achieved something. This is metonymic for virtue. And in fact, what James does with that saying is exactly this. He takes the saying, but he leaves misthos behind, reward, and he says you'll get a crown. So he's taken a saying from the Jesus tradition, but he's reperformed it in such a way that now it is apt for a civic environment where the rewards that people think are really worthwhile are not wages, but they're crowns. And a second example is both Q and James have this notion about the place, the proper storage place for your goods. Q says the proper storage place is going to be in heaven, because the danger of storage on earth, putting things in a treasury on earth, is that insects can gnaw on it, and clothing can be eaten by moths. So when you see this in Q, what you're looking at in Q is the writer taking the two emblems of status and wealth in an agriculture, which are food and clothing.
Dumbass.
Those are the main emblems of wealth. James takes over the saying, and he actually keeps both the moth-eating clothing and the insect-eating food, but he adds jewelry. That is, he says your silver and your gold is rusted or tarnished or corroded. So he's now added a third emblem of wealth, but it's an emblem of wealth that is appropriate to a civic audience, where one of the ways that you display status is not just through clothing, but it's through jewelry. It's through golden rings.
But it's through jewel scotchery.
And necklaces and earrings and things of that sort. So there's an instance where he's got a saying of Jesus that he sees that's quite useful for his rhetorical purposes. But he engages in this practice of emulatio to repurpose the saying, now not for an agrarian audience, but for a civic audience. So in one sense, the saying stays the same in the sense of what it is aiming at. That is, don't invest.
Well, now all we got to
in the
do is get rid of that
status
fucking
and wealth,
tone.
that are transitory and which will go away. But in proper treasures, piety and almsgiving for Luke and things like that. He simply repurposed the saying now for a civic audience. The point is really the same. Don't seek status and honor and jewelry
and jewel
and fine
scotchery.
clothing and so forth, because that's really not what counts. It's virtuous achievement, probably obedience to the Torah, and as he says earlier on in chapter 1, taking care for widows and orphans. That's a great biblical phrase. So those are the things that for James gain you status in the world, not clothing and certainly not jewelry. So it's this really interesting relationship with this Jesus tradition, where if we understand what he's doing is practicing this notion of emulatio, taking earlier traditional sayings and reperforming them now for the audience that you have, a civic audience, on the expectation that the audience will actually recognize what you're doing. That is, it recognizes that there's a Jesus saying lurking behind what you said, and will appreciate the way in which you have adapted the Jesus saying to the current situation. I should say that I think every preacher nowadays knows that that's what they do. I mean, they take biblical metaphors, biblical images, and so forth, and they repurpose them for now a 21st century American audience. In fact, unless you're doing that, you're not going to be a very effective speaker. So James is engaging in the same kind of procedure, and we've got a name for it, emulatio.
Can you tell us about the parallels between James and the Gospel of Thomas?
There's not many. The parallels that exist between James and the Gospel of Thomas are also the parallels that exist between James and Q. So it's not that James, as far as I know, James doesn't have any sayings that do not appear in Q or do not appear in the Gospels. So and the Gospel of Thomas
God's
probably
fucking
gives us
Holy Ghost.
a more verbatim or closer to verbatim
Holy
repetition of
Ghost.
Jesus' sayings. It's not quite verbatim, but the Gospel of Thomas is not doing this kind of thing that James is doing, where you paraphrase it in such a way that sometimes hardly a single word is still left of the original. James, the Gospel of Thomas is much more literalist in his recitation of the Jesus tradition. I mean, of course, he doesn't always completely agree, but I wouldn't say that there is a strong relationship between the Gospel of Thomas and James, and certainly in the Gospel of Thomas's attitudes towards the Torah and so forth, it's miles away. James is much more of a kind of a rigorist when it comes to the Torah, and Thomas has sayings like, unless you he wants to metaphorize or allegorize the notion of Shabbat, Sabbath, in a way that surely James is not going to, that James wouldn't approve of. Thomas is not a rigorist when it comes to the Torah by any stretch of the imagination.
Is the Q material in the letter of James closer to Matthew or Luke's formulation of it?
Sometimes one and sometimes the other. The scholar who did probably the best work on this is Patrick Harton, who wrote his dissertation on James and the Q sayings of Jesus. And what
Holy Ghost.
He was also a member of the International Q Project. And what he noticed was that if you compare Matthew's version of a Q saying and hypothetically what Q has, Q doesn't have the elements in Matthew that we're pretty sure that Matthew added himself. And likewise, Q doesn't have, James and Q don't have the Lucan parts that we think that Luke added to Q. So when he saw that, he was driven to the conclusion that it makes much more sense to imagine that James knows something like Q, but before it has been edited in the Matthean form that we have it, or in the Lucan form that we have it, because otherwise we'd have to explain why James would cite Matthew, but leave out of his citation the elements, the distinctively Matthean elements, or the distinctively Lucan elements. So this is the kind of thing that we do in synoptic problem study all the time. That is, you look at how Matthew edited Mark, and at least as a thought experiment, you can ask, well, is it possible that Mark edited Matthew? But as soon as you try to make that argument, you realize the difficulties you run into, because then you have to account for the fact that Mark would only take over parts of Matthew and not take over other parts of Matthew that are surely not objectionable to Mark. That is, why would Mark cut down Matthew? Or similarly, why would Mark cut down Luke rather than the other way around? Luke adding to Mark, editing Mark, Matthew editing Mark, adding to Mark. So it's a matter of deciding which direction of dependence is the likeliest. And when you come to James and ask, is there a good reason to think that James knows Matthew, then you immediately run into the problem of, well, why hasn't he actually then taken over the bits of Matthew that Matthew himself added to Q? And at that point, Harden said, well, it's simply much more efficient to imagine that James is using some version of Q. It's not exactly the version of Q that we reconstruct in the International Q Project, because James does have this saying on oath taking, not taking oaths, which does show up only in Matthew. James's version of it is a little bit different from Matthew's, but that would then suggest to us that Matthew has taken that oath saying from somewhere, and James, for some reason or other, has it too. But that's really the only place where James has something that appears only in Matthew and not in Luke and not in Mark.
And how does the letter of James, what is its relation to Paul?
I think it's an antagonistic relationship, and that antagonism comes out principally in the second part of chapter 2, where he never names Paul, but what he does is he imagines a kind of hypothetical situation where someone says, "I have faith," and they want to claim a kind of saved status on the basis of that, and he says, "Well, if I've got works, my works actually trump your faith only." And the way in which his argument is constructed, if you read through this is James 2:14 to 26, it's pretty hard not to imagine that he is either directly critical of Paul, or that he's critical of language that at least reflects Paul. It's a question of whether he's actually got Paul in mind, or he's got people in the Pauline tradition in mind who are repeating this salvation by faith alone. And his answer is faith without works is dead. Now that's certainly not a statement that Paul can ever make. Paul would ever make it, and he doesn't make it in either Galatians or Romans. So it's a rather antagonistic relationship that I think that James has to either Paul directly or at least to the Pauline tradition. And I should say also that the distinction that Paul tries to make between pistis and erga, between belief or loyalty to God and works, is a very peculiar distinction if you think in terms of the categories of the Hebrew Bible. That is, faithfulness, emunah, in the Hebrew Bible is always imagined to produce certain actions, or to put it the another way around, the way that you know that someone has faithfulness is you look at what they do. In other words, there's an immediate relationship between pistis, belief, and the product of belief, which is observable actions. Now, and that's actually James's view. That is, works are the thing, or activity, practices are the things that show that you really have pistis. Paul, for his own polemical reasons, and it has to do with his controversy with over circumcision, ends up producing a distinction between pistis and erga, between faith and works. That has a very peculiar context, a polemical context in Paul's career, but it is really quite un-Jewish. And actually, if you think about it for a second, even now we say, well, someone claims to believe such and such, but you look at what they're doing and there's something wrong with their claim. That is, you can't really to be a just person if you are continually producing unjust action. So we're perfectly aware that sort of separation of belief and action is an artificial one, and that's why people get accused of hypocrisy. So there's actually nothing new about the Hebrew Bible's view of the strict relationship between belief and action. And James shares that view. Paul doesn't, and as I say, for very particular polemical reasons, he makes that distinction. So James seems to stand on the side of the Hebrew Bible tradition against Paul on that question of faith versus works. There was a really interesting article done a long time ago, I think in 1964, by a French scholar, Etienne Tocquenay, that imagined James as the product of someone, a visitor to a Pauline community. And what he argued, I don't exactly buy this, but it's a lovely kind of illustration of tensions. He argues that chapter 2, this is the chapter that deals with the first part of chapter 2, which deals with rich people and the way in which they're deferred to in a church, and it's James objects to that favoritism. Well, he says if you walked into the church in Corinth, you would immediately be faced with patrons, with people like Stephanos and Gaius, Crispus and Phoebe, who Paul calls his patroness, and so he imagines James 2 as a kind of reaction to the patronage that he sees going on in Paul's churches. And then the second part of chapter 2 is the faith works thing. And so James writes that as a kind of a negative commentary on what he sees going on in Paul's church. And then chapter 3 has to do with control of speech, control of the tongue, and would immediately be faced with patrons, with people like Stephanos and Gaius, Crispus and Phoebe, who use the chapter 2. This is the chapter that deals with the first part of chapter 2, which deals with rich people and the way in which they're deferred to in a church, and it's James objects to that favoritism. Well, he says if you walked into the church in Corinth, you would immediately be faced with patrons, with people like Stephanos and Gaius, Crispus and Phoebe, who Paul calls his patron or patroness, and so he imagines James 2 as a
stupid
reaction to
because that was stupid
going on in Paul's churches. And then the second part of chapter 2 is the faith works thing, and so James writes that as a kind of a negative commentary on what he sees going on in Paul's church. And then chapter 3 has to do with control of speech, control of the tongue, and Tocquenay suggests that and has seen people speaking in tongues and is horrified by this, and comes back and he writes chapter 3 about the importance of controlling the tongue, because the tongue is a dangerous thing in Paul's church. And then chapter 3 has to do with control of speech, control of the tongue, and Tocquenay suggests that this hypothetical visitor has gone into the Corinthian assembly and has seen people speaking in tongues and is horrified by this, and comes back and he writes chapter 3 about the importance of controlling the tongue, because the tongue is a dangerous thing if left uncontrolled. So, I mean, this was I think no one really buys the way Tocquenay had sort of sussed out this scenario. On the other hand, it does present a kind of interesting dramatization of the distance between Paul and Pauline churches on one side and the folks that James is trying to influence on the other side.
So is it Jewish, Christian, or both?
Well, it's I would say it's I would say it's Jewish. I mean, the reason that I'm hesitating at this point is the term Jewish Christian, which we've thrown around for a long time, is increasingly a problematic term because no one who uses it can actually define what it involves. And the documents that have typically been called Jewish Christian, they really don't have a single set of characteristics upon which all agree. So it's the reason why I don't really want to call it Jewish Christian, because that term itself is so problematic a term. My hunch is, and I think others like Dale Allison would take the same view, is that James represents a kind of a stream of Hellenized Judaism that takes seriously Jewish identity, and especially takes seriously the importance of the Torah in Jewish identity.
Come on,
but it's a group that unabashedly and unapologetically has embraced the Jesus tradition, and so likely understands Jesus as a kind of enlightened interpreter of the Torah, just as Hillel and Shammai and others are different kinds of interpreters of the Torah.
Bones.
So if you want to call it Jewish Christianity or Christian Judaism, understanding that those terms are really muddy terms and difficult to use, then I guess that would be okay. But I think it really is important to see the strong allegiance that the writer of James has to especially Hellenized Judaism, the kind of thing that you see in Philo and in the testaments of the 12 patriarchs, neither of which are overtly Christian. The testaments have been Christianized by adding phrases here and there, but if you take away those phrases, there's a lot of similarity between the notion of religiosity that James has and the notion of religiosity that you see in both in Philo and in the testaments. One of the analogies that I've used is that James has, if you go to the airport to Ben Gurion Airport, and you're going to be handed one of these tractates by Chabad, and if you know nothing about the Lubavitchers, you read this. It's usually an invitation to be Shomer Shabbat, to be observant, and so forth. If you know Chabad, you'll immediately spot it as Chabadnik. And I'd say that you might think of James in the same way. The non-Christian, the pagan reader of James would look at it and say, "Well, this looks like this looks like the Jewish stuff that I've read elsewhere." The Christian reader is going to say, "Yeah, that's exactly what it looks like, but I hear Jesus there too." That is in these sentences that come without Jesus' name attached to them. But the Christian reader or the Christian user of the text is immediately going to know that, oh yeah, this is certainly Judaism, but it's Judaism with these bits of Jesus tradition sort of built into them. There's other examples of that kind of what I would call bifocal literature, where it's really it really imagines two different audiences: the kind of naive reader who takes it for what they see on the page, and the insider reader who realizes what this really is, where this really comes from. There's other examples of that kind of literary strategy, and I think that's what James is doing. He's producing a letter that is going to be legible to non-Jews, but Jews are certainly going to understand what the internal logics of the letter are about, and recognize, in some sense, their own religious practices in it. And Christ believers are going to also recognize that there's elements of the Jesus tradition sitting there.
the provenance and date of the Epistle of James?
A really good question again. So the late appearance of James on the scene, as I said right at the beginning, that it's not attested. No one quotes it before about 220 or 225 in the West, and 350 or so in the 220 in the East, and a century later in the West. That suggests to me that this is probably a relatively late writing, sometime in the early 2nd century, I would guess. And when I first started working on James, one of the first things I did is do my own translation of it, and which means looking at basically every word that he uses. And one of the first things I spotted is how frequently the rare vocabulary that James uses shows up in First Clement and the Shepherd of Hermas, and some of it in 1 Peter, and all of those are dated in the early part of the 2nd century. So James and these others, James and 1 Clement and Hermas, use this interesting neologism, dipsykos, which means literally to have two souls, and it's the term that James and Hermas use to describe the person who kind of waffles. That is, they don't have a single vision and a single intention. They're always shifting back and forth between is this or that. I don't really know. And the fact that James reflects that language, which, as far as we know, only starts appearing in the early part of the 2nd century, and there's actually a whole series of other words that belong to that sort of 2nd century vocabulary. The fact that it reflects those kinds of vocabulary choices suggests to me that we're dealing with a text sometime in the 2nd century, early 2nd century. Provenance is a more difficult matter, and I've had two different opinions on this in the time that I've worked on this. When I first started working on James, I was impressed by the fact that many of these rare vocabulary items appear only in 1 Peter, 1 Clement, and Hermas, all of which we think come from Rome. So when I first started writing on James, I ventured the opinion that it's a Roman document. It comes from Roman Christianity. But when I started working on this book that came out in 22, I guess, again, the thing that still bothered me is if it's Roman in provenance, why does it take another 2 centuries for anybody in Rome to quote it? So it doesn't get quoted in the West until Hilary of Poitiers, and then people like Pelagius and Augustine and other Latin authorities start using it. But how would we account for the fact that it's penned in Rome, let's say around 120, and no one bothers to mention it or quote it for another at least century and a half? That bothered me, and whereas it's quoted at least by about 200 in the East by Origen, and then almost immediately, probably in Syria, by the Pseudo-Clementine writer. So I ended up concluding that it's probably better to put it in a place like Alexandria, where we know also that a number of these vocabulary items that are peculiar show up in vocabulary in Alexandria, and show up in people like Philo from Alexandria. And it was then reading a biography of Philo that made me realize that there were very strong links between Rome and Alexandria, at least in the 1st century, and the Jewish communities there. There's a lot of travel back and forth. Marin Niehoff's book on Philo. When I saw that that she had documented the strong links between Alexandria and Rome, then that helped me account for the few vocabulary items that appear in James and in Roman documents. And but it's much earlier. But as I say, the problem, if you say that if it's written in Rome, why does no one know about it for another 150 years or so? Whereas that problem is alleviated a little bit if we put it somewhere in the East, in a place like Alexandria. But, deciding the provenance of documents is really a kind of mug's game. Until we find early manuscripts that we can provenance in Alexandria that are manuscripts of James, indications that these are the author's autograph copies. We're not going to know for sure. And the
come on, Snoopy, I'll put your black ass with stone.
Of any Christian document is
slut.
Zero.
Shit.
We're not going to be in a position to know that for sure. I suppose if we found some other early Christian writers earlier than 200 in Alexandria that are quoting James, that would make my conjectures a little safer. But on the other hand, if we found early Christian documents in Rome that were quoting James, that would change the picture again too. So it's with this kind of exercise, you do what you can with the thin evidence that we've got.
And in my closing question, do you think that the letter of James is familiar with any of the Gospels that we have in the New Testament?
No, I think it's only familiar with Q, or at least if it knew, say, Matthew or Luke or John.
God fucking damn it!
He doesn't tip
Holy goddamn ghost!
His hand, in such a way that we would say that he actually has knowledge of anything else. So he has knowledge. I think he has knowledge of Q. And that is about it. That's his main source of the Jesus tradition.
Suck my dick, bitch.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Clapperboard.
Thank you. Always nice to talk to you.
You suck my dick,
Thanks for
bitch.
watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to fund or support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.
You suck my dick, bitch. Now fuck up and move this phone out of here. Now I will dick you up, you slut. Come on, you stupid bitch. Come on, you slant-eyed slut. Slut. Ah! Spit. Ah, slut. One, two. March! Whisper, no. Slut. Whisper, no. You dumbass, at least try to use up as many movies as you fucking possibly can. Whisper, no. Spit. No, I'm not taking no draw. I'm gonna kick your ass. You slap-eyed slut. Whispering, no. Alright, fuck it. Ho! I stuck my dick up his butt and twisted. Slut.